As the hours passed and the flight progressed, Rebecca couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something about the Johnson family was wrong. Their calm demeanor only seemed to heighten her suspicions, making her more convinced that they didn't belong in first class, despite all evidence to the contrary. She even began to question whether she had missed something on their reservation. But then, as if to prove her wrong, their behavior remained impeccably refined. They didn't complain, they didn't ask for extra service, and they didn't even appear to be paying attention to the lavishness of the surroundings. It was as if they belonged there in a way Rebecca couldn't fully comprehend. The rest of the flight went smoothly, but in the back of her mind, Rebecca remained fixated on them. She couldn't stop thinking about their quiet confidence and the strange unease she felt every time she glanced at them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane began its descent into Paris. Rebecca went through her usual routines, preparing the cabin for landing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over yet. As the plane touched down, she proceeded with the usual deplaning procedure, helping the passengers gather their things. The Johnson family was among the last to leave, and Rebecca noticed James, Camille, and their children were taking their time, almost as though they were waiting for something. It wasn't until Rebecca was at the door, standing with the final few passengers, when a member of the ground crew approached her with an urgent look. "Excuse me, Rebecca," the man said, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "There's a VIP meeting in the terminal. They want you to be a part of it." Rebecca furrowed her brows. "VIP meeting? For what?" The man glanced back toward the Johnson family, who were now walking down the jet bridge, still at a relaxed pace. "That family," he said, gesturing subtly toward them. "They're the owners of Skylux Airlines." Rebecca froze. What? She could feel her stomach twist. Her mind raced as she processed the information. The owners? But how? Why? She'd been working with the company for years and she'd never heard anything about a family named Johnson being involved in the ownership. "No way," Rebecca muttered, almost to herself. "That doesn't make any sense." The man nodded solemnly, clearly used to this kind of reaction. "They don't make a spectacle of it. They prefer to stay low-key. They're here on a private matter, but they asked to speak with you, now immediately." Rebecca blinked, a sinking feeling beginning to settle in her chest. She had just forced them out of first class, humiliated them in front of the other passengers, and now she was being asked to meet them? It felt like the plot of a bad movie, a ridiculous twist that could only happen in real life in the most awkward, cringeworthy way possible. As Rebecca made her way to the meeting room in the terminal, she kept her face neutral, but inside she was seething with both confusion and embarrassment. How could she have been so wrong? She had judged this family based on assumptions, stereotypes, things that had nothing to do with who they were or what they represented. She could already feel the guilt creeping in. The room was dimly lit when Rebecca entered. James and Camille Johnson were sitting across from a few senior executives, all of whom turned to her as she walked in. "Ah, Rebecca," James said, his voice calm and measured. "Please, come in." Rebecca hesitated at the door, suddenly acutely aware of how small and out of place she felt. This wasn't the situation she had expected when she had walked into work that morning. James gestured for her to sit. "You may be wondering what this is all about. Camille and I prefer to keep a low profile. We don't like drawing attention to ourselves, especially when we travel." Rebecca's face reddened, but she didn't say anything. "Let me explain," James continued. "We were in first class tonight because that's where our tickets were booked. We always book our own travel arrangements, just like any other customer. And just like any other customer, we expect to be treated with respect." Rebecca felt herself shrink under the weight of his words. "We understand that you're simply doing your job," Camille added, her tone as soft and composed as it had been all flight. "But the treatment we received today was, well, unexpected. I'm sure you can appreciate that." Rebecca nodded slowly, still too stunned to form a coherent response. How could she have been so blind? James leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You have a very specific idea of what people should look like when they travel first class, don't you, Rebecca?" She swallowed hard, finally meeting his gaze. I didn't mean to." He held up a hand to stop her. "It's all right. We've dealt with this kind of thing before. We know how it works." He sighed deeply. "But what you should understand is that it's not about appearances. It's about people's abilities. We believe that everyone who works for Skylux should be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look, how they dress, or their background. That includes the employees, and it also includes our passengers." Rebecca's mind was spinning. Everything she thought she knew about the world, about class and status, was being turned upside down in that moment. She had judged them without even knowing who they were, simply because of her own biases and assumptions. "This isn't about you being a bad person, Rebecca," Camille added gently. "It's about the way we see the world, and we hope that from here on out, you'll take a moment to consider who you're really serving. Because in the end, we're all just people, trying to get from one place to another." Rebecca felt the weight of their words settle in her chest. She knew she would never look at first class, or her role as a flight attendant, the same way again. What she had once thought was a job of privilege and distinction now seemed like something much more complex. It wasn't about luxury. It was about respect. As Rebecca left the meeting room, her mind was awash with guilt, but also with a new understanding of the world she moved through every day. And as for the Johnson family, well, the next time she saw them, she would certainly treat them differently, because, as she had just learned, appearances can be deceiving, and dignity is the true mark of a person's worth. As the flight continued its journey through the night sky, Rebecca's unease deepened. Every moment that passed seemed to pull her further into an uncomfortable awareness of just how out of control she felt. The Johnson family remained utterly unperturbed by her actions, their demeanor calm, poised, and unfailingly polite, and yet their quiet composure felt like a slow-burning challenge to her authority. Why hadn't they reacted? Why hadn't they said anything when the service was delayed? Why hadn't they made a scene like the others she'd dealt with in the past? She glanced again at the man in the sharp suit, now back in his seat and casually sipping his whiskey. He was watching her, and she could feel his gaze like a weight pressing on her back. His earlier comment about the Johnson family had left an imprint on her, one she couldn't shake. "You never know who might be watching." The words lingered, heavy with implications she didn't fully understand. Why did it matter? Her instincts screamed at her, urging her to stay alert, to watch them more closely. She tried to quell the rising anxiety in her chest. It was just a family in first class after all. But something was off. Something didn't add up, and she couldn't put her finger on it. The way they'd been treated, the subtle delays, the disregard, was personal, she realized. It was as though she was being tested, and she didn't like it. Just then a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Rebecca, are you all right?" It was Melissa, her tone hesitant. "You look a little distracted." Rebecca blinked, shaking her head as though trying to clear the fog of frustration clouding her mind. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a tight smile. "Just a little tired, I suppose." Melissa seemed to buy the answer, but her gaze lingered, sensing the tension in Rebecca's body language. She nodded and moved away, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts again. Why was she so fixated on them? The Johnson family sat in silence, their children asleep, their parents whispering to one another in hushed tones. There was no confrontation, no loud complaints, no demanding voices. They were simply existing in the space, an almost imperceptible calm that unsettled Rebecca even more. Meanwhile, the other passengers, those she considered the regulars, the wealthy elite who often traveled in the luxury of first class, were oblivious to the underlying tension. They sipped their champagne, chatted amongst themselves, and reveled in the indulgence the airline promised. But Rebecca couldn't stop watching the Johnsons, couldn't stop wondering why they didn't just get angry, didn't push back. She turned away, trying to get a grip on herself. This wasn't her first time dealing with difficult passengers, but something about this felt different. It wasn't them, it was her. As the cabin lights dimmed and the majority of passengers settled into sleep, Rebecca's mind buzzed with questions she couldn't answer. She wanted to go back and ask the Johnsons what they were about, to confront them and demand an explanation for why they had made her feel so unsettled, but she knew she couldn't. She couldn't confront them without revealing her own uncertainty, her own failure as a flight attendant. The rest of the night passed in a blur of routine duties, but nothing felt routine. Every minute that ticked by felt like another missed opportunity to correct her behavior, to do something before things got even more awkward. Then, just as she began to feel she might be able to regain some semblance of control, the unexpected happened. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, signaling the final stages of the flight as they began their descent into Paris. But just as Rebecca was about to return to the front of the cabin, the sharp-suited man from earlier approached her once again. His presence was calm but authoritative. Every step he took seemed deliberate, his movements graceful, like a chess master about to checkmate. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice low, but somehow carrying an undeniable weight. "I think you should know something about the Johnson family." Rebecca's stomach clenched. She hadn't been expecting this. She had hoped the matter would fade into the background, but now it was coming to the forefront again, this time more directly. The man studied her with a piercing gaze, assessing her every reaction. "The Johnsons are not just regular passengers," he continued, his words deliberate, heavy with meaning. "They own this airline. Skylux is their company, and they don't take kindly to mistreatment of any kind." Rebecca's mind froze. For the first time that night, a chill ran through her, one that had nothing to do with the plane's altitude. She opened her mouth to speak, but the man raised a hand, signaling her to remain silent. "I'm sure you've noticed the delays in their service," he went on, his voice still calm but now tinged with a subtle reprimand. "And you've probably seen the way the other passengers are starting to notice. It's not just about their service, Miss Collins. It's about something deeper, something you've been too preoccupied to see." Rebecca's heart raced as she struggled to process what he was saying. The Johnsons owned the airline? How had she not known that? Her thoughts were a jumble of confusion and realization. All those little details, the delays, the subtle treatment, had been orchestrated, not just to make her uncomfortable, but to test her professionalism, to test her biases. But why? The man in the suit seemed to sense her growing panic. "It's not just about them, you know," he said, his tone now softer, almost sympathetic. "It's about you, and about how you treat every passenger on this airline. You've been here for 15 years, Rebecca. But it looks like you've been so focused on control that you've forgotten something important. That every passenger deserves respect, regardless of who they are." Rebecca stood in stunned silence, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she realized just how much she had allowed her own insecurities and assumptions to influence her actions. The man nodded once, then turned to leave. But just before he did, he glanced over his shoulder with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Think about it," he said softly. "And remember, you never know who might be watching." Rebecca stood in the galley, alone once again, the realization dawning on her like a slow-moving storm. The truth hit her hard. She hadn't just misjudged the Johnson family. She had allowed her prejudices to dictate her behavior, and in doing so, she had betrayed the very values the airline was supposed to uphold. As the plane continued its descent, Rebecca finally understood. She wasn't in control, not anymore. The story delves into a transformative moment in Rebecca's life, one that forces her to confront her biases, actions, and their consequences. As a seasoned flight attendant for Skylux Airlines, Rebecca begins her shift on a routine flight to Paris. However, her attention is subtly drawn to James and Camille Johnson, a composed and polite family in first class, whose presence stirs subdued curiosity among the passengers. Rebecca, though outwardly professional, interacts with the Johnsons in a manner tinged with unspoken prejudice, delayed service, dismissive glances, and a lack of respect. After the flight lands and passengers disembark, Rebecca bids the Johnson family farewell, trying to maintain professionalism despite her unease. James's unsettling glance lingers, and Rebecca's anxiety intensifies when Captain Harris calls her to the cockpit. There, she learns the shocking truth. The Johnsons are not ordinary passengers, but major stakeholders in Skylux Airlines, traveling anonymously to evaluate staff performance. Their experience, marked by Rebecca's subtle mistreatment, has been disappointing. As Rebecca processes the weight of this revelation, Captain Harris informs her that the Johnsons have requested a meeting to discuss her behavior. In the VIP lounge, the Johnsons' calm but firm presence forces Rebecca to confront the reality of her actions. James directly questions her, and while she admits to mishandling their service, she struggles to explain the deeper reasons behind her behavior. Camille, with measured resolve, underscores the broader issue of systemic discrimination, reminding Rebecca that her actions affected more than just the Johnsons. The conversation challenges Rebecca to reflect on her 15 years with Skylux, as Camille asks, "What have you learned in 15 years?" The seriousness of the situation is made clear when James informs her that the incident will be reported to corporate. Overcome with regret, Rebecca is left to process the confrontation, her mind racing with the realization that her biases have jeopardized her career. The Johnsons' words continue to haunt her as she drives home, facing the gravity of the moment. Arriving at her empty house, Rebecca receives an email notifying her of a formal HR review and her suspension. The shadow of potential termination looms large, and as her career unravels, Rebecca grapples with shame and self-doubt. Camille's piercing question, "What have you learned?" echoes in her mind, signaling the beginning of a pivotal moment in her life that could redefine her understanding of professionalism and respect. At her HR meeting, Rebecca faced Evelyn Moore, a stern manager, and an uneasy HR rep. Evelyn outlined the seriousness of the Johnsons' complaint, emphasizing systemic bias's impact on Skylux's reputation. Rebecca admitted, voice trembling, "I assumed they didn't belong in first class." Her honesty, though sincere, wasn't enough. Evelyn acknowledged Rebecca's exemplary service but stressed the broader cultural implications. Rebecca's suspension with pay was confirmed, pending a final decision. The suspension days dragged. Rebecca, stripped of her routine, replayed the flight endlessly, searching for a single action that could have changed the outcome. Yet, the truth was clear. Her assumptions, rooted in biases she'd long denied, had set everything in motion. The weight of her actions extended beyond her career, forcing her to confront a version of herself she hadn't recognized. She realized that rebuilding wasn't just about saving her job. It was about reshaping her values and actions to align with the person she wanted to be. Rebecca's career was shattered when Skylux Airlines terminated her for her actions on a flight. Isolated and consumed by shame, she received an email from a coworker, Melissa, who reached out with kindness and understanding. Although Rebecca had made mistakes, Melissa reminded her that change was possible. Overwhelmed by the loss, Rebecca began seeking personal growth, starting with confronting her biases. With her sister Leah's support, she embarked on a journey of self-discovery, eventually volunteering for a nonprofit focused on workplace equity. Years later, Rebecca stood as a transformed woman, no longer defined by her past mistakes, but by the lessons she had learned and the work she had done to become better.